If you ignore this map, your men will not make it out in time, the voice said inside the operations tent, but Lieutenant Colonel Jason Miller did not even look up from the tactical display. The forward command post at Ridgepoint Base was already tense before Captain Emily Carter spoke, with digital screens casting pale light across folding tables, radio operators tracking intermittent signals from a unit that had stopped responding normally 30 minutes earlier, and officers moving with controlled urgency that suggested the situation was already degrading in ways no one wanted to say out loud. Emily Carter stood near the edge of the command table, posture steady, eyes fixed on the terrain overlay projected across the central screen, her analysis already running ahead of what others were still trying to interpret. She had been called in as a tactical advisor, not as part of the chain of command, but her presence carried a weight that came from experience rather than rank insignia. Jason Miller finally turned slightly, acknowledging her only long enough to register disagreement rather than consideration, his tone calm but firm as he dismissed the recommendation to reroute the extraction plan, insisting that his unit would maintain the original approach and that adjustments were unnecessary at this stage. Around them, staff officers exchanged brief glances, aware that the disagreement was not about personality, but about timing. And timing in a situation like this could define outcomes long before anyone on the ground understood what was happening. Emily did not raise her voice, did not argue an emotion, only stepped closer to the map display and pointed out a structural inconsistency between the reported position of his forward platoon and the terrain corridor they were expected to occupy, noting that the difference was not minor drift but a directional displacement that suggested the unit was entering a restricted zone without proper lateral exit options. Miller responded with controlled frustration, stating that his men had navigated worse conditions before and that overcorrection based on incomplete data would create unnecessary risk, reinforcing his decision to proceed independently without external adjustment. The radio operator then reported a brief transmission from the field unit, fragmented but clear enough to confirm that movement had slowed significantly due to terrain constraints, and that visibility ahead had become limited beyond standard operational expectations. The room shifted subtly at that update, tension rising not through noise but through silence, as every person present understood that slowed movement in that environment often meant reduced options for maneuver. Emily maintained her focus on the overlay, recalculating position vectors based on updated signal drift, and when she spoke again, her tone was precise, stating that if the unit continued forward on the current axis without correction, they would lose the ability to re-establish safe directional alignment within the corridor structure. Miller finally faced her fully, his expression controlled but resistant, responding that command authority remained with him in the field and that he would not redirect his platoon based on advisory projection alone. The atmosphere in the tent tightened further as both perspectives held firm, one rooted in command structure, the other in tactical interpretation of incomplete but converging data, while outside the tent the wind moved across the desert terrain unnoticed, and inside, the difference between refusal and recognition was beginning to close toward a decision point neither side could delay for long. The silence inside the forward command tent did not last long, because the next incoming transmission from the field unit changed the atmosphere from controlled tension to active uncertainty. The radio operator adjusted the frequency twice before a fragmented voice came through, confirming that the platoon under Lieutenant Colonel Jason Miller had slowed to a near halt due to increasingly constrained terrain movement and reduced visual range, with navigation markers no longer matching expected positional references. Captain Emily Carter immediately refocused on the central display, her analysis updating in real time as she correlated the reported slowdown with the terrain compression patterns visible on the digital overlay, which now showed the unit approaching a zone where lateral movement options would become limited within a narrow corridor structure. Jason Miller listened without interrupting, his posture still rigid, but his attention clearly shifting between confidence in his original plan and the emerging inconsistency between field reports and projected movement data. Around the table, staff officers became more focused, with one quietly requesting a secondary confirmation of GPS synchronization across all forward elements, which revealed slight but consistent deviation between individual unit trackers, suggesting that the formation was no longer aligned precisely with the intended route axis. Emily pointed out that this pattern was not isolated signal fluctuation but a cumulative drift that indicated directional error compounded over distance, meaning that the further the unit advanced without correction, the more constrained their future maneuver options would become. Miller responded that his platoon had adaptive field capability and that minor navigational variance was expected in rugged terrain environments, reinforcing his decision to continue without immediate rerouting. Emily did not argue emotionally, but instead adjusted the projection to show projected movement paths over the next several miles, highlighting how the corridor geometry ahead would progressively narrow and reduce recovery options if deviation continued. A brief update came through the radio again, indicating that the field unit had reduced speed further due to terrain difficulty and that communication clarity was becoming inconsistent, with intermittent signal lag affecting real-time coordination. The tent grew quieter as this information settled, not because anyone was surprised, but because the implications were now becoming increasingly difficult to ignore within standard operational assumptions. Miller stepped closer to the display, reviewing both the projected route and the updated field coordinates, and for the first time his expression showed measurable reconsideration rather than dismissal. Emily maintained her position, stating again in a controlled tone that the current trajectory required immediate correction if the objective was to preserve safe extraction capability under constrained terrain conditions. The environment inside the command post remained stable physically, but the operational pressure increased with each update, as the gap between planned movement and actual positioning continued to widen in real time, forcing both command authority and tactical analysis into the same narrowing decision window where delay would carry measurable consequence for unit mobility and coordination integrity. The command tent continued to operate under a controlled but increasingly fragile sense of certainty as incoming field updates accumulated, with each new transmission from the platoon under Lieutenant Colonel Jason Miller reinforcing that movement through the terrain corridor was becoming more restricted and less predictable than initially assessed. Captain Emily Carter remained focused on the central tactical display, updating her mental model in real time as the positional drift confirmed earlier by multiple tracking systems now aligned with a clear pattern of directional deviation rather than isolated navigation error. The radio operator reported another partial transmission from the field unit, indicating that visual confirmation of forward markers had become inconsistent and that the terrain ahead was forcing slower movement with increased spacing between elements for safe coordination. Jason Miller stood closer to the display now, no longer maintaining the same fixed dismissal posture he had held earlier, as the convergence of field reports and digital overlays presented a growing discrepancy that could not be explained by standard signal interference alone. Emily adjusted the projection again, showing a comparative overlay between planned route geometry and actual movement data, which revealed that the unit had gradually entered a narrowing corridor structure that reduced lateral maneuver capacity and increased dependency on precise forward alignment. A staff officer requested confirmation of environmental factors affecting signal stability, but the analysis returned inconclusive regarding external disruption, suggesting instead that the deviation was primarily positional rather than electronic in origin. Miller reviewed the updated data silently for several seconds, then asked for a full status reconciliation of all forward elements, including spacing, velocity, and coordinate alignment across each vehicle in the formation. The response indicated that while internal cohesion remained intact, the entire formation had shifted slightly off the intended axis, creating a cumulative offset that increased with distance traveled. Emily maintained a steady tone as she explained that this type of drift, if not corrected early, would reduce recovery options significantly once the terrain corridor tightened further, making lateral correction increasingly difficult without full stop and realignment procedures. The radio channel briefly stabilized, and another update confirmed that the field unit had reduced speed again due to narrowing terrain conditions and limited forward visibility, with reports suggesting that natural ridgeline formations were now influencing movement structure more heavily than anticipated in the original planning assessment. Miller stepped back slightly from the display, his attention shifting between the live feed and Emily's projection, as the operational risk profile of continuing without correction became more apparent in the cumulative data set. Emily did not press further beyond presenting analysis, but her position remained firm in the recommendation for immediate recalibration before further advancement into the constrained corridor segment. The tent remained quiet except for intermittent radio updates and the subtle sounds of equipment adjustment, while the decision point between maintaining command autonomy and accepting tactical correction became increasingly defined by the narrowing gap between projected safety margins and actual field positioning. The operational command tent remained in a heightened state of analytical focus as the situation continued to evolve through successive field updates, with Captain Emily Carter maintaining her position beside the central tactical display while monitoring the increasing alignment between positional drift data and terrain constraint modeling that now clearly indicated a progressive reduction in maneuver flexibility for the platoon under Lieutenant Colonel Jason Miller. The radio operator delivered another partial transmission from the field unit, confirming that movement had slowed further and that environmental conditions ahead were creating tighter navigation margins, with reduced visibility between terrain markers and increasing reliance on internal coordination rather than external reference points. Jason Miller stood in front of the display without speaking for several moments, reviewing the updated overlay as the cumulative data now showed a consistent deviation pattern that could no longer be categorized as minor signal fluctuation or acceptable operational variance. Emily adjusted the projection once again, presenting a forward simulation of the next segment of movement, which demonstrated how the corridor structure ahead would continue to narrow and compress the unit's ability to correct course if the current trajectory was maintained without intervention. A staff officer quietly confirmed that all forward tracking systems now reflected the same directional offset, indicating that the deviation was uniform across multiple independent data sources, which reduced the likelihood of isolated device error and increased the probability of a shared navigation misalignment. The atmosphere inside the tent shifted subtly as Miller absorbed this confirmation, his focus moving between the live field feed and the projected route path, recognizing that the operational implications extended beyond minor adjustment and into structural route correction requirements. Emily maintained a calm and precise tone as she reiterated that the longer the unit continued on its current axis, the more limited their options would become for safe reorientation within the terrain corridor, particularly as the surrounding geography transitioned into a more restrictive passage with fewer lateral exit points. The radio channel briefly stabilized again, providing an updated field report that confirmed further reduction in speed and increasing difficulty in maintaining consistent formation spacing due to terrain constraints and narrowing forward visibility. Miller requested a final consolidated status check across all forward elements, including positional accuracy, spacing consistency, and navigation synchronization, and the resulting report confirmed that while internal cohesion remained intact, the entire formation had shifted slightly but consistently off the intended route axis. Emily stepped closer to the display as she outlined the projected risk of continuing without correction, emphasizing that the current drift, if left unaddressed, would significantly reduce the ability to execute a controlled reposition once deeper into the corridor structure. The command tent remained quiet except for equipment signals and intermittent radio updates, while Miller reviewed the totality of the data with increasing attention to the cumulative pattern rather than individual anomalies, recognizing that the situation now required a decision between maintaining original command intent and implementing immediate tactical recalibration. The environment outside remained unchanged and still, but within the command post, the operational certainty that had defined the earlier phase of the mission was now being replaced by a measured reassessment of navigation integrity and route viability under increasingly constrained terrain conditions. The command tent entered a prolonged moment of controlled silence as Lieutenant Colonel Jason Miller continued to review the consolidated operational data, with every screen in front of him reinforcing the same conclusion that Captain Emily Carter had already presented, namely that the forward platoon had entered a progressively narrowing terrain corridor with a measurable deviation from the intended navigation axis that was now affecting both movement efficiency and positional certainty. Across the entire formation, the radio operator maintained a steady monitoring cycle, receiving intermittent updates from the field unit that confirmed continued reduction in speed and increasing difficulty in maintaining consistent formation spacing due to the tightening terrain structure and reduced visibility of forward reference markers. Emily Carter remained beside the central tactical display, her posture unchanged as she observed Miller's prolonged analysis phase, understanding that the decision now required was no longer about interpretation of data, but about acceptance of corrective action based on converging evidence from multiple independent systems. Miller requested another full revalidation of all positional inputs, including satellite tracking overlays, internal unit coordination reports, and terrain mapping alignment, and as each layer was reviewed, the consistency of the deviation pattern became more clearly defined, showing that the entire unit had gradually shifted off the intended route rather than experiencing isolated navigation errors. A staff officer quietly noted that the corridor ahead, based on terrain modeling, would continue to reduce lateral maneuver options over the next several miles, creating a constrained passage that would limit the ability to execute any mid-route correction if the current trajectory remained unchanged. Emily responded calmly by reiterating that this narrowing structure was already influencing the field unit's movement behavior, as indicated by reduced speed and increased communication intervals, both of which were consistent with restricted terrain adaptation under real-time conditions. Miller stood still for several seconds, looking between the live field transmission and the projected route overlay, his expression reflecting a shift from initial resistance toward measured reconsideration as the full scope of the operational risk became increasingly evident through accumulated data rather than single indicators. The radio operator then reported a brief but significant update from the field unit, confirming that visual confirmation of forward markers had become intermittent and that the terrain ahead was beginning to require more deliberate navigation adjustments to maintain directional consistency. This update caused a subtle change in the room atmosphere, as several staff members focused more intently on the central display, recognizing that the combination of reduced visibility and confirmed positional drift represented a compounding constraint rather than an isolated field condition. Emily adjusted the simulation overlay again, projecting the next phase of movement through the corridor, which clearly showed that continued advancement without correction would result in further compression of available maneuver space, making later adjustments significantly more complex and operationally limited. Miller finally broke his silence and requested a structured correction proposal, asking Emily to outline a controlled recalibration process that would restore alignment without disrupting field unit cohesion, indicating that he was now transitioning from refusal to conditional acceptance based on procedural clarity. Emily provided a precise breakdown of the recalibration sequence, emphasizing a controlled pause, full coordinate resynchronization across all forward elements, and a gradual reentry into the corrected route axis to ensure stability of formation integrity during transition. The command tent remained focused and quiet as the decision framework shifted from debate to execution planning, while the operational environment outside remained unchanged but symbolically distant, underscoring the fact that the critical point of resolution was no longer about identifying the problem, but about implementing the correction before the narrowing terrain corridor further reduced recovery margins for the unit under Lieutenant Colonel Jason Miller. The command tent transitioned from analytical review into structured execution planning as Lieutenant Colonel Jason Miller formally acknowledged the need for a controlled recalibration procedure, with Captain Emily Carter immediately shifting from advisory analysis into operational coordination support as the recalibration framework was prepared for transmission to the forward platoon. The central tactical display now showed a stabilized projection of the corrected route axis, overlaid against the current field position data, clearly illustrating the divergence that had developed over time and the precise point at which the formation had begun to drift off the intended navigation path. The radio operator established a secured channel to the field unit and initiated a coordinated communication sequence, confirming that all forward elements were prepared to receive recalibration instructions and temporarily stabilize movement during the adjustment phase. Emily Carter reviewed the final correction parameters and confirmed that the recalibration process required a synchronized pause across all vehicles, followed by a unified coordinate reset to ensure that formation integrity would be preserved during the transition back onto the corrected route. Miller reviewed the procedure carefully, then formally authorized the controlled correction sequence, acknowledging that maintaining operational cohesion during recalibration was now the priority over continuation along the compromised axis. As the transmission was prepared for field relay, the tent remained quiet except for the steady input of updated tracking data and intermittent confirmation signals from the forward platoon, which indicated that movement had further slowed and that the unit was now operating under maximum caution due to restricted terrain visibility. Emily monitored the synchronization status closely, ensuring that all positional systems were aligned before initiating the correction broadcast, recognizing that even minor discrepancies at this stage could amplify once the unit resumed forward movement within the narrow corridor structure. The radio operator then delivered the recalibration instructions to the field unit, instructing all elements to hold position, verify coordinate alignment, and prepare for gradual reorientation onto the corrected navigation axis. In response, the field transmission confirmed acknowledgement, with reports indicating that formation cohesion remained intact and that all units were maintaining controlled spacing while awaiting further instruction. Miller observed the confirmation data without interruption, his focus now directed toward ensuring that execution in the field matched the precision of the planned correction sequence, as any deviation during implementation could affect the stability of the entire operation. Emily maintained a steady analytical posture, tracking the synchronization progress as each forward element confirmed readiness for recalibration, noting that the success of the procedure depended on strict adherence to timing and coordinated execution across all vehicles. The updated terrain projection continued to display the narrowing corridor ahead, reinforcing the necessity of correction before further advancement, as the reduced lateral maneuver space would significantly limit recovery options if alignment was not restored at this stage. Once all systems reported readiness, the command tent initiated the final coordination signal, authorizing the controlled recalibration process to begin in the field, marking the transition from assessment and disagreement into structured correction and operational realignment under the combined oversight of Captain Emily Carter and Lieutenant Colonel Jason Miller. The recalibration sequence transitioned from authorization into active field execution as the forward platoon under Lieutenant Colonel Jason Miller received the synchronized correction signal and initiated a controlled operational pause within the constrained terrain corridor, with all vehicles maintaining position stability while preparing for coordinate realignment across the entire formation. Inside the command tent, Captain Emily Carter monitored the live synchronization feed as each forward unit began the verification cycle, confirming positional data, updating navigation systems, and aligning internal tracking references with the corrected route axis that had been established during the planning phase. The radio operator maintained a continuous communication link with the field, receiving structured acknowledgments from each element of the platoon, indicating that formation cohesion remained intact and that all units were executing the recalibration procedure in accordance with the transmitted instructions. Jason Miller observed the synchronization progress in silence, his focus fixed on the real-time updates as the field data began to reflect gradual convergence toward the corrected navigation path, signaling that the recalibration process was taking effect across all elements of the unit. Emily adjusted the projection overlay to display both pre-correction drift and post-correction alignment trajectories, confirming that the directional offset previously observed was being systematically reduced as each vehicle completed its coordinate reset sequence. The field transmission reported controlled movement stabilization, with all units holding position during the final phase of recalibration, ensuring that spacing, integrity, and formation structure remained consistent throughout the adjustment process. Miller reviewed the updated data and acknowledged that the correction sequence was producing measurable improvement in route alignment, as the cumulative drift that had developed earlier was now being actively corrected through synchronized field execution. The radio operator confirmed that environmental signal stability remained consistent, allowing uninterrupted communication flow during the recalibration process, which further supported the accuracy of positional updates being received from the field unit. Emily maintained a steady analytical posture, tracking the final synchronization confirmations as each vehicle completed its coordinate verification and prepared to resume forward movement along the corrected axis. The terrain projection on the central display continued to show the narrowing corridor ahead, but now aligned with the corrected route structure, indicating that the unit would be able to proceed with improved navigational integrity and reduced risk of further deviation. As the last of the forward elements confirmed completion of the recalibration sequence, the field unit reported readiness to resume controlled movement, maintaining formation discipline and updated positional awareness in accordance with the corrected navigation plan. Miller issued the final authorization to proceed, allowing the platoon to re-enter forward motion under stabilized alignment conditions, marking the transition from correction phase back into active movement within the terrain corridor. Emily observed the resumed movement indicators as the formation began to advance in a coordinated and aligned structure, confirming that the recalibration had successfully restored route integrity and re-established operational continuity under controlled command oversight within the forward operating environment. The forward platoon under Lieutenant Colonel Jason Miller continued its controlled advancement along the corrected route axis as the recalibrated navigation data stabilized across all operational systems, with formation integrity maintained and movement resumed at a measured pace designed to preserve spacing discipline within the now confirmed terrain corridor. Inside the command tent, Captain Emily Carter monitored the live field feed as the unit transitioned from recalibration into forward motion, observing that positional tracking consistency remained aligned across all vehicles, indicating that the earlier directional deviation had been successfully corrected through the synchronized adjustment process. The radio operator maintained continuous communication with the field unit, receiving periodic status confirmations that reported stable navigation alignment, improved visibility of terrain markers, and restored coherence between movement speed and formation structure as the platoon progressed deeper into the operational corridor. Jason Miller stood beside the central tactical display, reviewing updated movement trajectories and confirming that the corrected route axis now matched the projected terrain path, reducing previous uncertainty regarding directional integrity and restoring operational confidence in the navigation plan. Emily adjusted the simulation overlay to reflect real-time progression, verifying that the unit was maintaining accurate alignment within the corridor boundaries while continuing controlled forward movement under stabilized conditions. Field reports indicated that the terrain ahead remained constricted but now corresponded with the corrected mapping data, allowing the platoon to proceed without the earlier risk of cumulative drift or positional ambiguity. Miller reviewed the consolidated updates and acknowledged that the recalibration had effectively restored coordination between all forward elements, ensuring that formation spacing, directional tracking, and environmental interpretation were now functioning within expected operational parameters. The radio operator confirmed that communication stability remained uninterrupted, enabling precise coordination across all units as they advanced through the narrowing terrain structure with improved situational awareness. Emily maintained a focused analytical posture, tracking the gradual progression of the platoon as it moved beyond the previously misaligned segment and into a section of terrain that matched the corrected route projection, confirming that lateral maneuver limitations were now consistent with pre-mission expectations rather than unexpected deviation. The command tent remained calm and structured, with all attention directed toward verifying sustained alignment as the unit progressed further into the operational zone without additional correction requirements. Miller observed the final sequence of updates showing stable forward movement and confirmed that the platoon had successfully re-established route integrity, allowing mission continuity to proceed under corrected navigation conditions. As the field unit continued advancing, the environment outside the command post remained unchanged, but within the operational framework, the transition from uncertainty to stabilized execution marked a completed correction cycle, with both command leadership and tactical analysis aligned in confirming that the forward movement had been successfully restored to its intended strategic path under coordinated oversight. The final phase of the operation unfolded under stabilized conditions as Lieutenant Colonel Jason Miller's platoon continued forward movement along the corrected navigation axis, with all forward elements maintaining consistent formation spacing and verified positional accuracy across the terrain corridor that now matched the recalibrated route structure. Inside the command tent, Captain Emily Carter observed the sustained alignment of real-time tracking data, confirming that the earlier deviation had been fully resolved and that the unit was now operating within expected operational parameters without further drift or directional inconsistency. The radio operator maintained periodic communication checks with the field unit, receiving structured status updates that confirmed stable movement, improved terrain visibility, and uninterrupted synchronization between all vehicles as they advanced through the previously constrained corridor segment. Jason Miller reviewed the final operational data set, noting that the platoon had successfully transitioned from correction phase into fully restored mission execution, with navigation integrity re-established and command cohesion maintained throughout the recalibration process. Emily Carter remained focused on the live projection display, tracking the platoon's forward progression as it moved beyond the previously misaligned section and into a terrain zone that now reflected accurate mapping correspondence, confirming that lateral maneuver conditions were consistent with pre-mission planning expectations. Field reports indicated that the unit was maintaining disciplined movement with no further positional anomalies, and that communication clarity remained stable, allowing continuous coordination across all forward elements. Miller acknowledged the completion of the correction cycle and confirmed that operational control had returned to standard mission parameters, with the platoon proceeding under corrected guidance and restored confidence in route accuracy. The command tent atmosphere remained controlled and steady, reflecting the resolution of earlier uncertainty as analytical focus shifted from correction management to mission continuation assessment. Emily made a final adjustment to the projection overlay, verifying that all tracked movement data aligned precisely with the intended route path, ensuring that no residual deviation remained in the system as the unit advanced deeper into the operational area. The radio operator confirmed one last full synchronization check across all forward elements, reporting complete consistency in positional data and communication stability. Jason Miller observed the final confirmation and maintained silence for a brief moment, recognizing that the initial refusal to adjust had been fully resolved through field validation and structured recalibration. Emily Carter closed her analytical sequence by confirming sustained alignment across all systems, marking the successful completion of the navigation correction and restoration of operational integrity. As the platoon continued forward under stable conditions, the command tent returned to routine monitoring, with both leadership and tactical analysis aligned in acknowledging that the unit had safely transitioned from a high-risk navigation discrepancy into a fully corrected and controlled operational movement phase.